Tom, why is this project called Call and Response?
Call and response is taken from the jazz and gospel practice, where one musician puts out a musical call and another one responds. And what we've done is we've taken that idea, we've translated it to music across the generations. We've taken pieces by Mozart that inspired Beethoven to write a response, and then we've commissioned current composers, in this case Dan Coleman, to write a response to the dialogue that Mozart and Beethoven started.
Well, you had to choose your composer for this. What made you think that Dan could respond to the call and response ideology?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that Dan is very steeped in the music tradition of Mozart and Beethoven. That's part of the reason. But the other part is that Dan is interested in all kinds of different music, pop music and jazz. So we thought that his response wouldn't be just a response to Mozart and Beethoven, but would be taking into account a lot of the music that's been written since.
And does it?
Absolutely does. And the one thing that's really exciting to me about the piece is that it starts with music that sounds quite modern and works backwards through time. And there are parts in the piece that sort of remind me of different composers like Stravinsky, for example. I mean, it always really sounds like Dan's own voice, but it certainly is reminiscent of a lot of composers who have come since.
Does performing his work in these concerts that you've been doing change in any way your performance of the works which inspired?
Absolutely. One thing that was really interesting is Dan's pointed out things to us about the piece harmonically and in terms of the variations that we hadn't thought of before. Just as a composer, he looks at it with a very different point of view than we do as performing artists. So that's been interesting. And also his piece, the way he treats variations through the piece and introducing them not as just a theme, like once upon a time there was this theme and then it goes through these different variations. Dan introduces it more subtly, sort of in the middle of the piece, and works through it. So that made us treat the theme and variations in the Mozart and Beethoven quite differently.
Yes, I noticed the sequencing is unusual. It's not in a normal sequence, but it does jump around a little bit. Does that make it more difficult to play, or just a little bit of a challenge?
I think it's a little bit of a challenge, but I think that that's part of what gives the piece its charm. The pieces we've chosen, I think we've chosen for that reason. And the reason that we're excited about the Mozart Quartet, K464, is the same reason that Beethoven got excited about it. And it obviously inspired him to the point that he modeled a quartet after the Mozart. He saw something very special and unique in that quartet, and it actually wasn't that well accepted at the time it was written. It had certain musical qualities, like extreme chromaticism, that sort of offended audiences at the time. Now we can look at it and say, wow, what an inspired piece. Mozart was so far ahead of his time, and obviously Beethoven knew that the first time he heard it.
But people think of Mozart as an elegant composer, as something that's wonderful to listen to and can raise your IQ if you play it for your children. But what you're talking about is something completely different.
Yeah, I mean, I think Mozart is a beautiful and elegant composer, but I think couched in those elegances are incredibly provocative ideas